This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Okay, our final speaker for this morning is John Moss, who has been a long-term friend of ICAR. John's a health economist, and we deliberately put John's talk at the end of the morning session because we're of the opinion in ICAR that allied health could do very much better in its understanding and engagement with health economics. And so we thought it would be appropriate for John to finalise the presentations this morning with the health economist's view, to just really set another agenda of thinking for the way forward in terms of health service delivery quality. So John.
Just finished it. This point's the...
That's the left. Wave? Will you look at me?
Yes. Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with a number of people with whom I've been a friend and a colleague for many years, which is always great fun. The rather droll entry there, I'll have a bit of economics with that. It's just to express a certain degree of frustration I might feel occasionally when somebody's got a research project together and it's the very last minute before it has to go into the funding authorities or something, and it just occurs to them, well look, it might be a good idea if we put some economics in because funding authorities are looking for that. Now I know you're not going to do that, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and explain the basic thinking behind incorporating an economic perspective into allied health services research and funding. So my aim is about transmitting an understanding of the conceptual basis of health economic appraisal. In other words, the bigger picture when you decide to add a health economics section to your research protocol on a grant application, or when you become involved in decisions about healthcare resource allocation, or when you're doing some sort of evaluative work that involves an economic aspect. Now, I hasten to say that this is not a how-to today. It's just not possible to do that in the amount of time that's available. This is what to be thinking about, what's going on here. Okay, this is a traditional view of the economic approach to things. For those from overseas, this is taken from a fire danger indicator. Thomas Carlyle, one of the early economists, was the chap who gave it the name the dismal science. He looks dismal. I want to make exactly the opposite point. And this is a point made by George Bernard Shaw, the English playwright, who, for example, wrote the play Pygmalion, from which My Fair Lady was derived. And George Bernard Shaw was very interested in economic questions, and the quote I'm picking up here from him is, "Economy is the art of making the most of life." And I'll try to explain that. So, what's the fundamental idea or ideology behind economics? Well, it's fundamentally about choice. So it's not about how to become more wealthy or how to raise income or anything like that. It's about how to make choice. What sorts of choices? Well, choice under the constraint of scarcity. And there's an underlying assumption here that the total amount of resources we have available as a world population to do what we need to do and want to do is never going to be as much as we would like. I mean, with the whole story of Spaceship Earth and all that sort of thing, I don't think I have to go into that in any great detail. So the observations are, firstly, that resources are finite, but that you can also do different things with them. The next best part of 30 minutes of your time is a resource. Maybe after a while you'll be thinking, what could I have done instead? Our wants are various and unlimited, and hence we must choose. So, just schematically, our resources, the old phrases for those, the words for those are labour, capital and land, or natural resources. And these are finite and capable of alternative uses. And what sorts of uses might we want to put them to? Well, I put healthcare up the top, just because we are about healthcare today, but one wouldn't ordinarily expect that most people would do that. There are a whole series of other goods and services that people might want, and somewhere here is recreation, having a good time. Our wants are various and they're unlimited. So we have to make a choice in that way. Now, that's the usual way of understanding economics. The other way is to talk about value added. And my prime theme in all of this is that economics is also very much about value, and in particular the value that any of our activities adds to the existing amount of value that's around. Now, value, I'm narrowing the definition here of value in terms of health-related quality of life that is gained. And it's the amount of value added from the finite stock of resources that we happen to have available to us. Which comes to the question that I posed here. Why should the allied health practitioner be interested in comparing the costs and outcomes of healthcare? The answer in a nutshell is to avoid unnecessary pain and suffering. Okay, how does that come out? Well, Calabrese and Bobbitt have written a very evocative book about tragic choices. And the sorts of choices we're making here are by no means, if you like, flippant. These are really choices about who's going to get what form of prevention or treatment or rehabilitative activity, and therefore who is going to live or do better than they otherwise would. These are tragic in the true Shakespearean sense. In other words, these sorts of choices cannot be avoided. Unless we live in a world where there's manna from heaven, we're faced with having to make choices as to what we can do. So we want to make those the best choices we can. The cartoonist has looked at this in terms, or depicted this in terms of the English hospital system, and it's the notion that for this extra patient to get into the system, some other patient has to miss out on what the system has to offer. It's just not possible in contemporary health systems to provide all the needed health services that everybody could at least possibly benefit from. Now, the R word. So we're talking about how to make the best we can with the resources we have available. There are some other ways that this is done, all of which I suggest are well known to allied health practitioners because they bear some of the brunt of them, and none of them are particularly rational. This is from Smith in his editorial in the British Medical Journal. Traditional unjust rationing can occur by delay, such as by putting people on waiting lists, long waiting lists, by discrimination, particularly against the elderly, by dilution, in other words, for example, inadequate staffing levels, or by diversion. In other words, this isn't a health problem, this person with this problem can move to the social care sector or somewhere else. Now, I think it would be remiss of me if I didn't talk about alternative perspectives here. An alternative perspective to the notion that resources are finite and we have to make choices. And the main alternative perspective is that it's not that resources are finite, but they're very unequally distributed. And some people have more than they could possibly, or we could possibly imagine they need, and many people have a lot less, and that we need some sort of greater equity in the distribution of resources. Now, that I think is a fair comment, but again, I think we would also have to retort that even if a fairer distribution of resources, whatever that might be, turn out to be, was actually achievable, we'd still face the problem that ultimately our resources are finite. Now, health economic appraisal has become much more common over the last 20 or 30 years, and here are some examples of it in action. The first one I put there is the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee in Australia, because I do consulting work as part of a team to that organisation, and every new drug that there is a sponsor, a manufacturer seeking approval to have that listed on the subsidised medical system in Australia, needs to make a very detailed submission about the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness of that drug before it is approved or otherwise. Okay, I trust that I was speaking loud enough to be heard up the top anyway, but the Medical Services Advisory Committee is another initiative in Australia. This is done with all medical practices and technologies that are proposed for implementation. You'll also possibly be aware of the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, or NICE, in England. And then there's a series of other agencies, including one in Canada, one in Sweden, one in France, and so on and so on. These are becoming much more common, these initiatives. Now, I notice that the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is very much flavour of the month here in Australia, within the Act that establishes that, there is an intention to start looking at economic aspects. Here's clause 34C, that the support provided to the client represents value for money in that the costs of the support are reasonable relative to both the benefits achieved and the cost of alternative support. And if you go on to the NDIS website, you'll see that there's actually a fact sheet developed now about economic benefits of the NDIS. It's relatively early days in terms of the content there, but I would imagine that that will develop quite a lot. Okay, now when you read the NDIS document, it tends so far to have a somewhat financial perspective, but I want to contrast two perspectives in general on public funding of the health system. The economic perspective, which I'm talking about today, and the financial or the accounting perspective, which is probably the one that we're most used to. Partly the reason we're most used to it is that we adopt that sort of perspective when we're managing our own credit card, or quite often if you're managing, as many of you would be, managing a centre budget, you'd be adopting a financial perspective. Now here's where the differences are. The economic perspective is that resources are used to generate health outcomes that people value. And there's a need to prioritise to support the most cost-effective interventions because resources are ultimately scarce and because we want to add the most value we can. The financial perspective or the accounting perspective is that in the public system, taxpayer funds are spent, and that's very readily available presented to Parliament every year and so on, yet the benefits in terms of what happens to the patients are not by any means as readily visible. It boils down to an imperative almost to control and curtail expenditure, and can even go as far as to see the sick as a burden on the productive worker. So, a couple of misconceptions that can arise from adopting an accounting perspective. The concern about free services. Well, the services we're talking about are not free. They're free at the point of delivery. And they include, of course, the ones I've mentioned there. They're funded, however, by the taxpayer through government. And the little acronym down the bottom stands for, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Someone is paying. It may well be you. Another misconception is the satirist Auburn Waugh's idea of the economic patriot. Again, this follows from having an accounting or a financial view of the health system. The responsible citizen has a patriotic duty to eat, drink, smoke and be merry, and just jolly well die, rather than hoard the prospect of a dismal longevity. In other words, this perspective is only seeing the resource costs of what we put into the health system, and they're not seeing the benefits for the people concerned. And just one other point before I move to a slightly different topic. I want to make the distinction between the statistical patient or the identifiable patient. Everything that I'm saying is about how we plan the health system for population aggregates. It's not about what should be done with the individual patient in the clinic. The clinician is in a different ethical position to the health planner and health manager. In particular, the clinician is acting as an agent for the patient, is trying to do the best for that patient and not necessarily thinking through what's the best for the system as a whole. Nevertheless, if we're dealing with a world of absolute freedom, your decision as a clinician that you're going to go for broke, your patients are going to get everything that they could possibly use. That can only be achieved if other clinicians don't have that level of clinical freedom to do that sort of thing themselves. And this applies, for example, when we're choosing which patients should have priority, and for particular groups of patients, which health technologies and practices should have priority. Okay, are there any questions so far? Okay, well, at least I've given you a moment to pause and reflect. Let's talk more specifically about economic appraisal. Now, you need to be a two-handed health economist. You need to deal with resources and their costs on the one hand, and on health outcomes on the other hand. And incidentally, health outcomes can be good, they can be positive, or they can be negative. They can be burdens. So let's start by classifying costs. These are the sorts of resource items that one would focus on. Firstly, the so-called direct costs. They're the direct costs to health services and also the direct costs to patients and their families and carers. So the direct cost to health services, capital costs, in other words, the costs of building the big buildings and purchasing the large items of equipment. And these services of capital items last over many years. Whereas there are current costs of personnel and consumable items like drugs, they're consumed on the go. And it turns out that in most health systems, it's not the technology and it's not the drugs. The most expensive item in the system are the personnel costs. Now, of course, it's often necessary to consider costs to patients. The system might be free at the point of delivery, but there are other issues, such as those I've listed there, which patients have to pay for out of their own pockets, or their families do, including resources where money changes hands, like over-the-counter medications, but where money doesn't change hands, like informal care. But informal care is a cost to someone, it's a cost to the informal carer who could be doing something else with their time, and so on. Now, the other aspect of this is much more controversial, the notion of indirect costs, and I'll summarise by saying that the leading authority in this sort of area in Australia, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, won't accept evidence on indirect costs unless a specific case is made for that. An indirect cost might be, for example, that if you treat a whole lot of people with high blood pressure, some of them will wind up going to work, whereas they otherwise wouldn't have been able to. Or they make it to work more often, presenteeism and absenteeism. In other words, they make it to work more often and they are more productive while they're there. I'm not going to say anything more about that, but to say it's controversial and in general it's not given a high priority. Now, so what are we trying to measure? Well, we're measuring costs on the one hand, we're trying to measure effectiveness on the other hand, and effectiveness is the extent to which an activity meets its stated objectives. In other words, what health outcome gain has been achieved. And you've probably heard of the idea of the quality, which I hope to describe in more detail in a while. This is just one particular measure of health outcome gain. It might be a gain in survival, it might be a gain in some measurement, say on an SF36 or something like this, of effectiveness. Archie Cochrane, after whom the Cochrane Library is named, makes the point that with chronic disease, where there may well be an ongoing downward trend, effectiveness in this case may be where at a particular point of intervention the downward trend is not as acute. Okay, where do you get this information? Well, you get this information from randomised controlled trials, that's best, but otherwise from a method that will enable you to adjust for systematic error, in other words, other variables that are having an influence and you're perhaps not recognising that. This is what we call bias. Now, okay, here's a very basic and, in fact, too basic measure of health-related quality of life. Something that Alan Crockett and I actually constructed. You can see how much thought's gone into it. One day for a study we were doing. We presented this to patients with chronic lung disease. We said, this is your quality of life thermometer. 100 degrees Celsius, if you like, represents good health. 0 degrees represents death. There's a bit down here below that, because there are some states of health that people regard as worse than death, you know, chronically incapacitated and in severe pain and so on, and ask the people where to locate themselves on that thermometer. This is a visual analogue scale, and later on we'll talk about doing it from 0 to 1. Well, 0 to 100 is mathematically and arithmetically very closely associated with 0 to 100, and 0 to 1 can be readily interchanged. Okay, so we're just going to use this basic measure, an inadequate measure to start with. We're just going to use it, and we're going to consider the aggregate of a person's quality of life on this sort of measure as it proceeds over time, and call that quality. So the number of years you spend in this particular health state is your number of qualities. Now, what we calculate is something called the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or wUNISA. We want to know the increment in costs divided by the increment in effectiveness. In other words, the cost of the new intervention minus the cost of the comparator intervention divided by the outcome for the new intervention divided minus the outcome from the comparator intervention. I'm using comparator here, I could have used control instead. And this is the incremental cost effectiveness plane. This is a depiction of where this incremental cost effectiveness ratio might be found. This axis is the increment in cost, this axis is the increment in effectiveness. Over here, here is where the comparator is. So over here, if you had an incremental cost effectiveness ratio that was where my red pointer is, you'd say, well look, this intervention costs more and is less effective. There's no rational reason for doing that. We can forget about it. Down in this quadrant, this intervention represents an increase in effectiveness and it's less costly. Well, the answer's obvious. Go to it. No need to ask further questions. I won't deal with this quadrant except to say that usually authorities won't allow less effective interventions to be used, even if they're going to be less costly. So the most important area is this one up here, the trade-off, where you've got an increased cost from the new intervention, but it also gives you an increase in effectiveness. So here are two different interventions. This one here has increment in effectiveness, so we can read from that. An increment in effectiveness that we can read on this axis, an increment in cost on that axis. Here's one that has much less of an increment in effectiveness and a much greater increase in costs. Now, if the choice was between those two, which would you choose? You choose A. Now, let's say that there are many, many of these interventions. There are hundreds of them. Which ones do you choose? Well, there's this notion of lambda. Lambda is the threshold at the highest incremental cost effectiveness ratio that the decision maker, in other words government, is willing to fund. So it's expressed as the additional cost per unit of health outcome gain, in other words, perhaps a quality gain. Now, in Australia, the government has been determined never to reveal what its threshold is. And that I think they did right. In England, they do. In England, they talk about a threshold between 20,000 and 30,000 English pounds per quality adjusted life year. In Australia, it's probably somewhere around $50,000, but in order to respond to circumstances, government doesn't explicitly say what it is. Okay. Now, so far I've dealt with the cost side, the comparison of costs and health outcomes. Let's talk a bit more about health outcomes. Can health be measured? Well, we all know that there are great difficulties in pinning down what we actually mean by health. It's multidimensional, it's subjective, it occurs in a context, it's argued over in various ways. So at best we're going to get an indicator of health, something that is a rough approximation there too. Now, Jeremy Bentham, who flourished a couple of hundred years ago, talked about the notion of a philosophic calculus. He thought you ought to be able to come up with a measure of pleasure and or pain arising from action. For example, the two things that currently give me greatest pleasure at least would be red wine and chocolate, And I ought to be able to, on a scale, say how much red wine gives me pleasure and how much chocolate gives me pleasure. And I usually have some difficulty telling the difference. This was the guy that went on to talk about utilitarianism as the greatest happiness of the greatest number, which of course is underlying the economic notion of getting the maximum value out from scarce resources. In other words, a focus on outcomes, or what's also known as consequentialism. So Bentham invented this idea called utility. Utility is the capacity of a good or service for satisfying a human want. Now, you don't normally hear this mentioned in ordinary conversation. It's a rather special view. There's cardinal utility, which I was identifying here. I know this much pleasure I get from chocolate and this much from red wine. Or there's ordinal, which on a particular evening, in particular circumstances, I'd rather reach for the bottle than for the chocolate box. I don't know how much extra pleasure I'm getting, but I at least reach for one. This idea is approximately synonymous with welfare or satisfaction. Now, the health measures that we use in health economics are called, wait for it, generic, preference-based measures of health. And before that, they were called multi-attribute utility instruments. And what they're trying to do is place a value on each health outcome observed. Generic, in other words, it should be applicable to all sorts of health states, not just lung-based ones or kidney-based ones. Preference-based, that somehow it's not just a rating like I talked about, it actually measures the force of my preference or the community's preference for this particular health state. And the other point is, of course, it's only concerned with health, it's not concerned with all the other things that go to make life worthwhile. Here are a number of them. The most common one is probably the EQ5D. I know some people here have talked about using the SF36, and there's a thing called the SF6D which can be derived from the SF36. These are instruments. They usually have a number of domains. For example, the EQ5D has 5 different domains, and the SF6D, funnily enough, has 6 different domains. Here's the SF5D website, which I thoroughly recommend having a look at. And there you'll find that the EQ5D, it's a standardised instrument for use as a measure of health outcomes. It comes in 5 dimensions: mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain and discomfort, and anxiety and depression. So you've got 5 different dimensions. Each dimension has 5 levels of severity. So each of these dimensions is rated as no problems, slight problems, moderate problems, severe problems, extreme problems, plus another scale that we won't worry about too much for the moment. Now, these things are utility indicators, and to cut a longer story short, what we need to do is to calibrate on the 5 dimensions so as we can bring them down, collapse them down to 1. And that 1 dimension then becomes the utility. Utility is a state of mind, and thus it's not readily available to an observer. So the EQ5D, for example, is an indicator, and it's subject to imperfections in attempting to measure that state of mind, as are all utility measuring instruments. So there's not perfection in this game, and my personal view is that we'll never get to perfection in this game. For example, the EQ5D doesn't have a suitable question to assess disutility from blindness, ditto from breathless, and does your knowledge that you have a particular health state, which for the moment isn't causing you any problems, namely hepatitis C positivity, does that affect your utility? And another problem is the different GP, BM give you different utility scores. And I also should mention that it's usually not possible to get to the very top or the very bottom of the scale. Okay, so there's a basic outline. Obviously there's so much more that could be said, But I want to leave you with the notion that health economics, when you add it to your research, is about how to demonstrate the value that you're getting for the amount of resources that are used. You're comparing the costs that are used up on the one hand with the health outcomes that are used on the other hand, and that beyond that then becomes a more technical issue as to how do you measure the costs and the health outcomes. Okay? Thank you all very much.